The talks for lifting sanctions on Iran with the P4+1 are happening in Vienna. Whether there has been progress or not depends on the source. While one report says that 70 to 80% of the text is written, Iran's lead negotiator says it's not over till it's over, in so many words. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at how close or how far the two sides are in these sanction lifting talks and whether Israel or Republican lawmakers in the U.S. will be the stumbling block in these talks. Let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. We have Sid Mohammed Marandi, who's a university professor and political analyst, joining us. Also joining us, Marcus Papadopoulos, a historian, political analyst, and author, who joins us from London. Let me first start with you, Sid Mohammed Marandi. You are in Vienna, and it's a pleasure actually to have you, and for you to take this time out to talk to us, because obviously your introspective on this is very important, given the fact that geographically you're there. Do you think, based on the 3 days of talks, that the U.S., I'm sorry, that that was a slip, that the P4+1 has actually come to these talks with the way that Iran has termed the talks as sanctions lifting nuclear talks to be occurring? Is that the approach that has been taken by them?
Well, the Russians and the Chinese are very much on Iran's side. They support the Iranian position. They openly supported the Iranian position at the negotiating table. I think, in a very impressive way. The Europeans, they are basically not the decision makers. They are countries that, on appearances, they are sovereign and independent, but sadly, they are on the decline, and they are increasingly dependent on decisions that are made in Washington, or they obey decisions that are made in Washington. So it's no secret that the Europeans are constantly in contact with the United States. And so we have to see if the Europeans at the negotiating table, through whatever mechanisms that they use, if they're willing to abide by their commitments that they signed up to, and the Americans signed up to in 2015. Remember, the Americans, after the deal was signed, they immediately began violating the deal. You know this as well as I, so do many of your viewers, that Obama, he told the US Treasury to threaten banks, for example, not to work with Iran. And that is a direct violation of the deal, because the deal basically said that the United States must not impede the normalization of Iranian trade. Obama did the exact opposite. So that's one reason why the Iranians are now saying that there must be verification. On the other hand, when Trump came to power, he began to impose all sorts of sanctions. He left the deal, of course. But all of the sanctions, whether he claimed they were about human rights or missile technology or terrorism or anything else, it was all a part of the maximum pressure campaign. And the maximum pressure campaign was to force Iran to accept changes to the nuclear deal. So the Iranians are saying that all those sanctions have to be removed, A, because they were part of a campaign to force Iran to appease the United States, and B, because those sanctions impede the normalization of Iranian trade, which must be facilitated in accordance with the nuclear deal. So the Iranians are waiting to see if the Europeans and their allies are willing to abide by the nuclear deal. They've caused a lot of suffering, and they are in no position to make excessive demands towards Iran.
Sure. Let's break this open a little bit. One of the points that Marcus Papadopoulos, our guest there, Sid Mohammed Marandi, made, and that is the actual functionality of the European side and the depth or the lack of depth that they have in terms of decision making, something that Iran has actually observed and said that the European side is does not really, it doesn't appear that they have any clearance really to make decisions, to make approvals on certain issues perhaps, and that they need to discuss this with officials either higher up in the government or ultimately they have to go to the American side and see what they have to say. is how do you view the way that they're functioning in these sanctions lifting talks?
It should be said, first of all, that it is deeply regrettable that the meeting in Vienna is occurring in the first place, because had America not withdrawn from the JCPOA and then subsequently placed sanctions on Iran, then undoubtedly the deal, which is a landmark treaty for trying to usher in a degree of peace and stability in what is the most volatile parts of the world, would be overall and relatively speaking in good condition. And I cannot begin to emphasize the significance of having a positive outcome to this meeting in Vienna, because if there is no agreement, if the sanctions on Iran are not lifted, then it is possible, just possible, that America and Israel might rely on the military option to prevent Iran from developing uranium for civilian purposes. It is very, very worrying and very dangerous. And as regards to the Europeans, well, America is present at the meeting in Vienna through Britain, because after all, Britain and America are kindred spirits. When it comes to Germany and France, whilst both countries deep down would like to see the JCPOA survive and prosper, at the end of the day, both of them are subservient to America. Both of them are politically, economically, and militarily dependent on Washington. And so it is inconceivable that the French and the Germans will voice the opinion in Vienna that America should lift its sanctions. Because if America was to recede the sanctions which Trump placed on Iran following Washington's withdrawal from the JCPOA, then it is conceivable that the JCPOA could continue, even without America present. But the chances of America lifting the sanctions are nil. After all, Joe Biden has criticized numerous aspects of Donald Trump's foreign policy, but he has never condemned Donald Trump for having placed sanctions on Iran following Washington's departure from the JCPOA. So quite frankly, the presence of the Europeans in Vienna amounts to nothing.
Well, to understand the progress or lack of it, depending on how you look at it, Said Mohammad Marandi, that has been made, one has to refer first to what Iran has said, and that is, we are going to continue where Iran left off, even though they have said that that is only a draft and there's no concrete agreement made, and that that could be also altered or negotiated. So your take on that statement from Iran, and also the fact that, according to one source, for example, stating that 70 to 80% of the text has actually been written, and of course Iran's lead negotiator said, but it's not over until an agreement has been reached. If you can give us your understanding of that.
Well, I can't comment on 70 or 80% because it really doesn't mean anything. What constitutes 70%? What constitutes 80%? What constitutes 60%? So I really can't comment on that. What I can say is that the Iranians have not accepted the first 6 rounds as definitive, as you rightly pointed out. They said that we'll go over them, those issues or those things that have been written, those elements that have been negotiated and discussed that are acceptable to Iran will be approved, and those which are not will have to be renegotiated and changed. So it's not a rejection of the past 6 rounds, and it's not an approval of everything that happened during the past 6 weeks, and I think it's a logical position to take. Those 6 rounds were negotiated. Nothing was final. and the new team has to, as they pointed out, everything has to be resolved before a decision is made. So everything that would mean that those 6 rounds, what was discussed in those 6 rounds, is a part of that broader package. But I think the most important thing that impedes an agreement is the United States not being able to make a decision. The United States feels that it has too many problems at home. Biden is weak, he's unpopular, his opponents are well ahead of him in the polls, Trump is well ahead of him in the polls, and he doesn't want to be seen as weak. And that puts him in a weak position to make a decision. And on the other hand, the American arrogance always impedes the United States from doing the right thing at the negotiating table. So I would be very cautious about any prospects for a deal because of U.S. traditional arrogance and also problems at home. But at the same time, if the United States were to take everything into account, the fact that China is on the rise, Russia is on the rise, the United States is in a very difficult situation in West Asia, the costly wars have led ultimately to the really embarrassing retreat from Afghanistan. The United States has to cut costs, and I think they've already lost to China the economic war. But still, if they want to compete in some meaningful way, they have to cut their costs. And the smart thing for the United States to do, with Iran growing more powerful in the region, its allies growing more powerful in the region, the Iranian nuclear program being much more developed than it was a few years ago, the smart thing for the United States to do would be to do a deal. So the rational thing is for the Americans to end this. But since the United States is not necessarily a rational actor, then it's very difficult to say what will happen. And I don't think that anyone should count on 70 or 80% or 90% or 60% or 30% as a way to gauge whether we're heading for an agreement or not.
Sure. The elephant in the room always remains when we talk about Iran in a sense, and that is Israel. Marcus Papadopoulos, Iran has had a reaction, or has made a statement, I should say, regarding how an accusation against Israel of trumpeting lies to poison the Vienna sanctions lifting talks. Quote, Israeli regime whose existence relies on tensions is at it again, trumpeting lies to poison the talks. All parties in the room now face a test of their independence and political will to carry out the job, irrespective of the fake news designed to destroy prospects for success. That's what Iran has said. How deep can Israel affect these sanctions lifting talks?
Well, the American-Israeli strategic partnership is of immense significance in the context of not just the Iran nuclear deal, but also any other matter concerning Iran. Firstly, the Israel lobby is immensely powerful and influential in Washington. And at the same time, Israel is America's main conduit for American power and influence, not just in the Middle East, but also in North Africa. And I'm sorry to disappoint your viewers, but there is no evidence whatsoever that America's supremacy in West Asia is in doubt. It is certainly the case that America's objective in Syria was defeated by the Syrian people and by the assistance of the Russians and the Iranians. But America's mastery in the Middle East is, as I say, is not in doubt. And when it comes to the JCPOA, the Israelis, of course, do not want America to return to the agreement. They very much want the sanctions to remain on Iran because it has weakened the Iranian economy, and in particular, it has caused a lot of suffering for the ordinary Iranian man, woman, and child. And for America, the sanctions on Iran mean that the chances in the eyes of Washington of the Iranian economy collapsing and as a result bringing down the Iranian authorities is more and more possible. So that is why the Americans will not return to the Iran nuclear deal, and they will not recede the Trump era sanctions. Let us not forget that Joe Biden is a self-professed Zionist. He has no respect for the Iranian revolution. He wants to see the Iranian revolution destroyed as much as Trump does, as much as Obama does, etc., etc. So the American-Israeli factor when it comes to the JCPOA
Right.
is, in my opinion, of paramount importance.
Okay, one issue that we're facing here, and we're hoping that you can clarify this for us, Professor Morandi, is the fact that you have, like I'm looking at this, what's called a Johnson-led bill that would subject any future agreement to a two-thirds majority vote in the Senate, which makes it even harder for this for the talks to succeed. And if there was any type of success there, that you know, it's going to still get rejected by these hawkish Republican lawmakers. I mean, we're looking at the midterms coming up, and perhaps they're going to take over. Are we looking, even if there was a success here, that this could still get rejected at home and therefore not be applicable?
It's not really important for Iran what the problems inside the United States are. The Iranians are expecting the United States to abide by its commitments. If the United States can't, then that's something that the international community will see. The very fact that the Iranians are at the negotiating table is to show the international community who is serious and who's not. It was the United States that walked away from the deal. It was the United States that tore apart the deal. It was the United States that imposed its will upon the Europeans, and it was the United States and the Europeans that imposed maximum pressure on ordinary women and children. But they failed. And while your guess is correct, the United States is still a powerful force in West Asia, but the United States is on the decline. There's no doubt about that. China is surpassing the United States. I think it has surpassed the United States, but you know that's debatable. The United States rivalry with Russia, China, and Iran is very costly, and the Americans are basically spending trillions of dollars on three fronts, and it's not sustainable. As your guest rightly pointed out, the United States and the apartheid regime are very, very close, and Biden himself is an advocate, like other American politicians, of apartheid. And there's a consensus among Republicans and Democrats. But in any case, the Iranian position is clear. Iran is growing more powerful in the region. Iranian allies are growing more powerful in the region. The Iranian nuclear program is not something that the Americans can stop. Any military attack by the Israelis would be met with a disproportionate response. And any attack by the United States would mean the devastation and destruction of those countries in the region which have allowed the United States to carry out these attacks, countries which have American bases, and that would lead to a global economic catastrophe. So there is a sort of balance of power at play here. The Americans are not going to engage in war with Iran, and the Israelis, if they carry out an attack, they would be met with a disproportionate response. So either we're going to have stalemate, but even with stalemate, the maximum pressure campaign has failed. And increasingly, countries and neighboring countries are going to do trade with Iran, especially with the new policy of the new administration. And China and Russia are going to have to increasingly ignore the United States because the U.S. sanctions are a threat to their future as well. And with the development of the new technologies, blockchain technology, and other new means of carrying out trade and business, it's going to be increasingly difficult for the United States to enforce its sanctions in future. And as we are seeing, despite the great difficulties that ordinary Iranians or people with lower incomes in Iran face, the United States simply has no more leverage. They've done all they can, and they failed. So if the United States wants the Iranian nuclear program to develop, and if the United States wants Iran, Russia, and China to move closer to each other, it's pursuing the right policy.
We're going to end it there. Thank you, Sayyid Mohammed Morandi in Vienna. A pleasure talking to you, university professor and political analyst, and in London, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author. Thank you both for your input.
Thank you.
And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. Thanks for being with us. From me, Kaveh Tahwei, and the entire team of the Capital Tehran, it's goodbye.